Hello. um, I am going to review the David Lynch movie, Wild at Heart. I explained this in my last video, but I am rewatching a lot of Lynch movies, and I'm going to review them at length. And then once I've kind of rewatched all of them, I'm going to rank all of them in probably a few weeks. But to get into it, Wild at Heart is his fifth movie, immediately after Blue Velvet. His first film of the 90s stars Laura Dern and Nick Cage, and actually, I think was met with pretty mixed reception, but surprisingly won the Palme d'Or that year at Cannes. This is a weird Lynch movie to pick to be the Palme d'Or winner. But, I guess this is something French people like. I don't know. I think it is one of the weaker Lynch movies, which a weak Lynch movie is still a really great time and a really great movie. But there were quite a few issues in this thing that bother me just a little bit. The first one being that it's sort of weird for the sake of being weird, which obviously Lynch is labeled as a very strange filmmaker, but typically there's sort of a method to the madness going on, or at least something that's like thematically cohesive to his films. But here, I just think there's a considerable lack of connective tissue or like anchor to the movie that ties together all these strange ideas and all these very like misorganized vignettes. Plot is certainly not tying it all together because it's very loosely plotted. It's essentially just Sailor and Lula, Cage and Dern's characters run away from Lula's family, and Lula's family wants to go get them. So it's basically like a road trip movie, and I think it's at its best when it is leaning into that. Cage and Dern are really great here. I love the romance. I think both their characters are very well written and are sort of being used to explore different conflicts that you might have in a relationship, like a troubled past or wanting to return back to that troubled past. I just think it's really compelling whenever it's just them, hanging out in a hotel room or driving around or doing whatever. I think the movie works really well when it's focusing just on them. That brings me to my second main complaint about this movie, which is that it does focus on them quite a bit, but it also has this other subplot that sort of brings in a bunch of other different characters that make the movie feel very messy. This subplot centers around Lula's mom, who's trying to get them back, doesn't want her to be with Sailor. And I just don't really find anything going on here very compelling. There's like a love triangle between her and Harry Dean Stanton's character and this guy who's like a mob boss or something. It's never really fully explained, I don't think. And the movie tries to explain it a little bit. It's got a lot of exposition to it that I think is a little bit heavy-handed. I like the idea of framing this exposition in the context of Lula and Sailor just sort of telling each other small stories whenever they're like hanging out in bed together, but I think that there's just like a lot of convolution to what's going on here, and I don't think it ever really pays off into like tying it together in a neat little bow. The subplot also doesn't really have a major bearing on the plot. It's very much separate from the Lula and Sailor storyline, even if like it kind of ties together into the past of these characters. There's nothing really in the present that the mother or these other characters are doing to like actively contribute to the plot. I like Harry Dean Stanton as much as anyone, but he really has nothing to do here, and neither do a lot of these supporting players in this movie. Again, Cage and Dern are great, but the other people here, again, just feel like their characters are absurd and out there for the sake of being interesting. And that means the movie is never really boring. There's always something, a lot of somethings, all going on at the same time. And they're all very hard to decipher and very entertaining in that way that only Lynchian movies really can be. But once again, I don't really think any of these plot lines find ways to wrap themselves up in a satisfying way. They just sort of are left hanging for whatever reason. I think that it's telling that the third act of this movie, which centers almost entirely around the Lula and Sailor storyline, is the best part of the movie, hands down. This also introduces Willem Dafoe's character, who works really well as this antagonist that's sort of playing both of these characters and kind of splintering their relationship a little bit. Dafoe is incredible in this movie. He's very creepy, but also like clearly having an absolute blast, which is also how I feel about Dern and Cage. I'm surprised that Nick Cage never worked with David Lynch again after this, because I think that his weird, out there, expressionistic form of acting pairs really well with what Lynch does filmmaking wise. The dialogue just sounds really good coming out of Nick Cage's mouth. Him and Dern just have a lot of space in this movie to really go for it and just kind of go out there with what their performances are doing. They're both very like melodramatic and ridiculous, but in a really, really fun way that I think makes the movie watchable, even if sometimes it feels very, very messy. With other Lynch movies, there's typically some like central theme that's tying everything together. With Eraserhead, it's fatherhood. With Mulholland Drive, it's fame. And with Inland Empire, it's sort of acting, I guess. And whenever you kind of figure out what the central theme is, you can essentially decipher, for the most part, what Lynch is getting at with a lot of his strange, surreal ideas. But with Wild at Heart, I don't really think there's a tight central idea, besides maybe like love, which I think is just too broad of an idea to be something you're exploring in a 2 hour and 15-minute movie. There's just not enough time to really get into the nuances of love and relationships and romance and all of that. And I think Lynch does his best here, but in some ways, I think there's even like better instances of him exploring romance in his other stuff, like Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet. But I do think while Wild at Heart does fail, sort of, in being like a thematically potent movie, I also don't think it's necessarily trying to be, which sort of makes it stand out in Lynch's filmography. It's a lot of just him having fun and doing strange things as a filmmaker. I think it's a lot more about specific scenes and less about like a general overarching plot, which in a way means it doesn't necessarily work as a film, but every now and then it really reaches like this magical moment. Most of those great scenes center around Cage and Dern's characters just sort of running into weird circumstances while they're on the road. And I think that's kind of how I feel about Wild at Heart. It has a lot of fun moments and a lot of entertaining things going on within it. It has a couple of performances I really like, and the general vibe is pretty fun. But I don't really think it works coherently as a movie. I think there's a lot of different ideas coming in here that feel a little bit half-baked, feel a little bit rushed. I think that some of the plot and the exposition doesn't really work either. It seems like it's intent on exploring this idea of the mom's life and like all these weird things going on with her and like the criminals she's associated with, but I never found myself being compelled by any of those ideas. I just always felt like it should get back to the romance at the center of it. I think like a stripped back version of this could really, really work. But as it is, I think it's one of Lynch's messiest movies, which isn't to say it's a bad time, but I do think it's pretty weak as a movie in comparison to the rest of his filmography. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I would give this thing a 3 out of 5, and I think that's it. So yeah, goodbye.